Voicing the Void, Muteness and Memory in Holocaust Fiction. She has served as president of the Association for Jewish Studies, member of the academic committee of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and founding co-editor of the Azrieli series of Holocaust Memoirs and of the journal KEREM. So thank you so much for being with us here today.
Okay, sorry. First, this is the night for Morris. I think it's best that you do the whole introduction again.
Okay.
Because it got us into it and then it dumped. So
There was an initial delay. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Actually, since we're going to do that, are you going to have the slides on the live stream?
Yes.
Okay. And
and you're going to tell them when to switch.
okay. Okay. So are you going to have me on the live stream too, or just my voice then?
Both.
Oh, okay. You have a wide camera. Okay. All right. I just want to make sure I'm positioned in a way that works for you. That's all.
Okay, wait a second. You said that. Go ahead. Okay. All right. Action.
Okay, welcome everybody to the second part of our Serling Institute introduction to the Guide on Anti-Semitism for the MSU community. I'll show it. For those of you who weren't here at the start, we wrote it over the last year or so, and we have a copy of it available on the Jewish Studies website, jsp.msu.edu. So please check that out. And we are very thrilled, as part of our introduction to this guide and thinking about Jews and anti-Semitism, to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Sara Horowitz, who is here from York and had a long drive, and we're very thrilled that she made it for us. So Dr. Sara Horowitz is professor of comparative literature and humanities and former director of the Israel and Golda Koschitzky Center for Jewish Studies at York University. Her authored and edited books include Shadows in the City of Light, Paris and Post-War French Jewish Writing, Günther Adler, Life, Literature, Legacy, and Voicing the Void, Muteness and Memory in Holocaust Fiction. She served as president of the Association for Jewish Studies, member of the academic committee of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and founding co-editor of the Azrieli series of Holocaust Memoirs and of the journal KEREM. And actually, I forgot, but I'm supposed to gratefully acknowledge our donors for this event as well. Our sponsors, excuse me. So we have many sponsors, which is amazing to get so much partnership across the university. The College of Arts and Letters, James Madison College, College of Social Science, Residential College of Arts and Humanities, Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion, Peace and Justice Studies, Department of History, and International Studies and Programs. So thank you very much for making this possible. And welcome to Dr. Sara Horowitz to talk about loving me, loving Jews, genders, and the anxieties of belonging. Thank you.
Thank you. Amy, thanks so much for that warm welcome, for the introduction. I'm so thrilled to be here because I think this is just an amazing accomplishment, and so I'm really happy that my talk is part of celebrating that accomplishment. I'm really in awe of it. I'm going to focus tonight on intersections of anti-Semitism and gender, because you can't talk about anti-Semitism, I think, without also talking about gender. That is, a culture's ideas about what women and what men are and what they do. The discourse of anti-Semitism and the discourses of gender are so enmeshed that it's really hard to tease one away from the other. This evening I want to touch on two things. First, an external discourse about Jews and gender, that is, what other people say about Jews, and secondly, an internal conversation, that is, what Jews say about Jews and how both conversations are gendered. And finally, I'm going to end up with a case study, a 21st century case study that we're going to a little bit unpack together. Whether you're talking about the internal or the external conversation about Jews, gendered images of Jews reflect not only popular stereotypes, but they also reflect anxieties about identity, exclusion, assimilation, belonging, a whole roster of things that concern us in modernity, but also concern people in the past. So in other words, what do we talk about when we talk about Jewish men and Jewish women? If we could have the next slide. My starting point this evening is the 1972 film, The Heartbreak Kid, which some of you might remember, and I'm going to show a clip a bit later, so that will refresh your mind, but not the 2007 remake of that movie starring Ben Stiller, the original movie starring Charles Grodin. From there, I'm going to reach backwards in time, and then I'm going to move forwards in time until the 21st century. The 1972 movie Heartbreak Kids builds in complicated ways on Jewish American cultural anxieties in the third quarter of the 20th century. It's kind of a cultural artifact. Like the 2007 remake, the original film focuses on a man who meets the woman of his dreams, but unfortunately, he meets her right on his honeymoon. He's already married someone, and he has this stunning realization that he married the wrong woman. He's fallen in love with, at first sight, with someone he meets on his honeymoon. But unlike the 2007 Ben Stiller movie, which is really about caddish men, the 1972 movie really puts Jewishness at the center, and that's why I'm going to focus on it. The screenplay, which was written by Neil Simon, expands upon a short story written by Bruce J. Friedman that was first published in 1966 in Esquire, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is an American magazine aimed at a male readership. And if we could see the next slide, please. Oh, no, one before that, I think. Yes, thank you. Okay. Both Simon and Friedman were 20th century Jewish American writers who were born in the Bronx, roughly 3 years apart. Simon in 1927 and Friedman in 1930. Simon was a playwright, Friedman was a novelist, and both ended up at some point in their lives writing screenplays for Hollywood. They both drew on their Jewish working class backgrounds and the lower middle class milieu of their youth. That was their inspiration. Friedman's story, A Change of Plan, and what I have on the slide is kind of looking at it as it appeared in Esquire in its first publication. It's less elaborately drawn than the movie is. It's narrated in the third person, but told from the viewpoint of the protagonist, who's only referred to by his last name, Cantro. He moves quickly from an abruptly unraveling marriage to an impassioned courtship. The marriage, he's married to a woman who's only referred to as the bride. She never gets a name because we move from her pretty quickly in the story. And the courtship is of a woman he meets on his honeymoon. She is an Episcopalian college student from Minnesota named Sue Ellen Parker. The bride's only flaw in the movie seems to be the fact that Cantro has no physical passion for her. And the story contrasts that with the intense passion he feels for Sue Ellen as soon as he sees her. He describes Sue Ellen's, and I'll quote the story, Sue Ellen's nice fleshiness, a good 130 pounds to his bride's 104, and Sue Ellen exudes the smell of honey. I like that quotation where he compares Sue Ellen's body because it's fleshier and sexier than his skinny wife, which kind of flips around the way those two women would be troped now, right? The non-Jewish woman has something you can kind of hold on to, and is sexier for that reason. While the newlyweds make what the narrator calls a feeble pass at sex, their first night in Miami, Cantro's courtship of Sue Ellen is intensely sensual. Again, I'll quote, it includes all the things he had missed. Although Sue Ellen's father is initially against anything to do with Cantro pursuing his daughter, and it's understandable since they meet on Cantro's honeymoon, Cantro announces that he will pursue Sue Ellen, and Mr. Parker eventually comes around because he's swayed by the determination of you Eastern boys. And let's hold that phrase, you Eastern boys, in our mind. In the original Esquire magazine publication, the author dedicates the story, and you can see the dedication in small print above the reproduced page, but I kind of included it in bolder type for you to see below. The author dedicates the story to, quote, any man who has ever, for one fleeting moment or more, harbored the thought that his wife was not the absolutely most wonderful woman he ever met. The story reflects the mood of the 1960s, the relaxing of sexual mores, the prioritizing of personal fulfillment over any kind of obligation. The Jewish elements of the story, they're there, but they're kind of understated, they're kind of subtle. There's nothing really identifiably Jewish about Cantro's first wedding, which was hastily arranged with the justice of the peace. But at the wedding of Sue Ellen, his second wedding with Sue Ellen, he observes, quote, the strange blonde people with great Scandinavian profiles who mill around him at the church. Mr. Parker's grudging appreciation of Eastern fellows like Cantro can be read as encoding Jewishness, Eastern Jewish, if you're a Midwesterner, if you're from Minnesota. But the aspiration of a young Jewish man to escape what he views as the confines of his origins and be part of the dominant culture is only one thread of that story that captures other elements of America in the Vietnam War era. The illustration in Esquire by Stan Mack, and you can see a bit of the illustration, I think, up there, depicts grooms in tuxedos walking with naked brides through a maze. Really nothing Jewish in what Esquire is trying to draw out. But in Heartbreak Kid, which was released 6 years after the publication of Friedman's short story, the intertwined issues of religion and social class are important visual elements of the film. And maybe the next slide. Yeah, okay. So the film is framed by two weddings. The first one that you see here comes up minutes into the film, pretty soon after the credits finish rolling. And it's a wedding between Lenny Cantro, he's got a first name now, and Lila Kolodny. She has a name. The bride is a woman who insists on her virginity, excuse me, until marriage. And their relationship, and the wedding in particular, emphasizes the ambivalences of Jewish ethnicity. In this scene, which is shot, excuse me, from the rear of the room, most of the guests, as you can see, most of the male guests wear kippot, or I really should call them yarmulkes because they are those silk kind of things that perch uncomfortably on people's heads. There's no chuppah. And the wedding is performed by a justice of the peace who's wearing a black robe. So it's not a religious ceremony, even though the men are wearing kippot. And it does end with a traditional breaking of the glass. And the guests break into a hora to the tune of Hava Nagila. That music from Hava Nagila continues into the next scene. It's the music track for the beginning of their motor trip down to Miami Beach, Florida, where they are going to celebrate their wedding and a honeymoon. If we can have the next slide. The film closes with Cantro's second wedding, again shot from the back of the room. And this time, as you can see, it shows the couple kneeling in front of an altar with a big cross poised over them. So religion frames both the beginning of the end, and it is kind of the subtext of the film. So in contrast to the story, where the bride pretty quickly fades from your consciousness, Cantro announces to her right away in the story, I met somebody and the marriage is over, you're better off, goodbye. The movie really kind of stretches it out, and it takes great pains, the film does, to depict Lenny's deceitfulness. He finds excuses not to spend time with his wife so that he can spend time with this new woman that he has met. It also takes great pains to show Lila Kolodny's undesirability as a woman. Their first intimacies, which the film briefly shows, depicts her doing things that just make him uncomfortable. And she constantly comments during their several-day motor trip down to Florida on how they will have 40 or 50 years together. And every time she says it, the camera lingers on his face in a kind of, let's say, unreadable expression that viewers interpret. Jeannie Berlin plays the role of Lila. She's Elaine May's the director. She's Elaine May's daughter. And Elaine May directs her to really play up the character as gross and vulgar and kind of crass. So she's emotionally insecure, and she's always pushing food on him. And let's, in the next slide, there's a video clip, if we could see that.
There's a lot of things that you didn't notice about me, and a lot of things I never noticed about you.
Lenny, look. You're gonna see us in 50 years? That's gonna be us. Isn't it, Lenny? Excuse me. Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lenny,
What?
you tell me if there was something wrong with
There's
you.
nothing wrong. I'm always quiet in the morning, really. You have a little, little egg salad on your face.
Sure?
Yeah.
Don't call home then, okay?
Yeah.
I told Mom.
Sure.
Yeah. This egg salad, great.
You like it?
An egg salad nut. That's another thing that you're gonna have to get used to. You want a bite? Huh?
Okay, so in that really brief clip, it just encapsulates so many things about her and about how he views her, right? Her manners are terrible. She stuffs things in her sandwich. She gets it all over her face. She talks with her mouth open, and she pushes food on him. All of these things that clearly are beginning to bother him. And not only that, they've just embarked on their honeymoon, and she's already talking about, well, we have to call my mother. So in many ways, she is a kind of stereotype of the Jewish woman, or embodies a lot of stereotypes that were floating in culture about Jewish women in that era, and that date back, and I'll talk a little bit more about what they date back to. And she contrasts, and if we can look at the next slide, Lila contrasts really sharply with the object of Lenny's desire, renamed in the film Kelly Corcoran. Remember in the story she was Sue Ann Parker, now she's Kelly Corcoran, and she's played by this supermodel, Sybil Shepherd. Svelte, blonde, straight-haired, tanned, golden. Kelly just exudes confidence, whereas Lila's constantly asking, do you love me? Was the sex what you imagined? It was what you imagined, or better than what you imagined? Really, is it okay? Am I okay? Do you love? Kelly is just sure of herself. And that, all of those things are what attract Lenny to her. The camera catches her with light that makes her face glow, whereas when we see Lila in this shot, she is in bed because she stayed on the beach for too long, right? Kelly tans, Lila burns, and she's covered with this kind of cream and can't go outside. But whenever we see Lila in Florida, her hair is frizzy, she has a terrible sense of style, and she's confined to her hotel room for a while so her husband can court Kelly. Lila embodies physically and emotionally some of these central tropes that are associated with Jewish women that develop in Jewish American culture in the 1960s and 70s and really take off. Entrapping, suffocating, unattractive, while Kelly's ease and good looks embody what came to be called in that era the Shiksa goddess, the Gentile woman who is irresistibly attractive to Jewish men, who represents the ideal of feminine beauty. So linked to these gender tropes, if we could see the next slide, is socioeconomic class. Both Lila and Lenny are either working class or lower middle class. As the credits roll, we see Lenny right near his place of work in a kind of rundown neighborhood. He works in what he keeps referring to as a sporting goods store, but it's clearly not a fancy sporting goods store. He served in the military, and in his bedroom, which isn't in this poster, isn't in this slide, there is a pennant from CCNY, or the City College of New York, which has always been referred to as the poor man's Harvard, emphasis on poor. Lenny is in a very, very different social class, and when the bellboy brings the suitcases up to the hotel room, he doesn't know how to tip him. He's not sure he's tipping the right amount. He tips him, and then he calls him back, he gives him more money. So Lenny is uncomfortable around money, and Kelly, by contrast, comes from wealth, and her styling, flirtatiousness, and confidence remind us of that. And if we could see the next slide. Kelly's father is a banker. Their Minnesota home is large and elegant, and there are servants. I mean, they're in a whole other socioeconomic class. Kelly's mother keeps referring to Lenny Cantreau as Contreau, as though he's some kind of exotic French liqueur. The Jewish name, they've never heard of him. So The Heartbreak Kid, this movie, gestures towards these recurrent images of Jews that we've come to recognize in anti-Semitic discourses. These images circulate in popular culture, and literature, and art, and movies, and in political and social discourses. They reach across geographic, national, and cultural boundaries. The tropes move through Europe, across the Atlantic and the Americas, and they morph as they travel. I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of them. While these recurrent images are touchstones to the way Jews are imagined and feared, they also connect to broader issues about how the other, more generally, is imagined and feared. In cultural and political discourse, notions of gender and race, they function together as what you could say are important signifiers of otherness and outsiderness. Both external discourses about Jews and the internal discourse among Jews rely either implicitly or explicitly on gendered tropes, these recurring patterns that are attached to sex and sexuality. The Jew, the Jewish male, often figures, as you know, as effeminate, as weak, as passive, or, as aggressively greedy, as rapacious. And you mentioned some of these in your introduction to the guide that you just published. In the popular imagination, excuse me, gender difference and Jewish difference, they become intertwined and they fuel each other. One of the things we can talk about is that in the European imagination, these older stereotypes about Jews, the Jewish male is off in some way. His masculinity is not normative. He is physically imagined as weak or effeminate, and that attaches to a certain kind of moral weakness in his moral fiber. On the other hand, he is sometimes viewed as having an uncontrollably rapacious sexual appetite, again, something that attaches to the racialized other more broadly. But one thing is clear in the European imagination: a Jewish man is not a man like other men. And this has something to do with how cultures view Jews, but it also has to do with how they negotiate ideas about who belongs, who can be a citizen, who is part of culture as it changed. So if we look, for example, about the debates that first began to surface in liberalizing democracies, is there a place for Jews? Should Jews grant citizenship? They really they are unfolded in tandem with discussions about what the place of women are. And the most obvious example I can give of that is the French Revolution. The French revolutionaries debated whether women should be treated with equality. Should women become citizens? And they said, well, you know, women aren't really fit for, I'm kind of paraphrasing the debate, maybe oversimplifying a bit, but the gist of it is they said, well, women really aren't fit to be citizens. They're kind of weak-minded. They are overly sentimental. They're superstitious. They tend to go over-emotional on things. Weak moral character. They can be kind of manipulative. And that's not a fit subject, you know, to be a citizen. But then others argued, but, you know, maybe they're not biologically like that. Maybe that's not part of their essence. Maybe they're like that because they've been denied access to education. Maybe they're like that because they have no opportunity to do things. Their life is boring, and they develop these other sides of them. So let's open the doors. This is the beginning of the Enlightenment. Let's open the doors to women, and maybe if we give them the chance, women will show themselves to be fit citizens. Simultaneously, the conversation was going on about Jewish people. Are Jews fit to be citizens? And like, imagine that the revolutionaries debated this at length. Are Jews fit to be citizens? Well, the people who didn't want Jews to become citizens argued, no, they are of weak moral fiber, they are manipulative, they are untrustworthy, they are not the kind of people that we want building our society. And the people who argued against giving Jewish citizenship felt that this was of their essence. That is, Jews were innately like that. The people who wanted to accord Jews the rights of citizenship argued something else. They said, no, no, no. Jews are like that because they've been denied access to our culture. If we opened up the doors to them, if we made them our equals, if we gave them access to guilds, to professions, to education, then they would be just like us, and they would be productive citizens. So you can see how the two conversations about women and about Jews, they go along parallel lines. The debate is whether both women and Jews are biologically inferior, or whether their inferiority can be alleviated by opening the doors to them and by, by educating them and giving them additional opportunities. One of the things, of course, that you can note about it is that for women to be acceptable citizens, they have to become like men. And for Jews to become acceptable citizens, again in the French context, they have to become like their fellow countrymen, not Jewish. They can be Jewish kind of privately in the house, and that is the division that came to characterize the formula of the emancipation. The public sphere, the civic arena, that is neutral. Jews are not Jews in public, but Jews can be Jewish at home in some way or in their place of worship. They can be Jewish and worship the way that we worship, and their Jewishness excuse me, is relegated to the domestic realm, which is also the sphere of women. So again, Jews and women are kind of troped together. If I can go back to this cultural artifact that we're looking at, excuse me, I have a cold that's not COVID. I've been testing. I just want to reassure you. If the cantro of Bruce J. Friedman's short story is driven by physical desire, the Lenny cantro of the Heartbreak Kid is aspirational. He is looking to escape his Jewishness and to climb socially and economically. The film suggests that the latter, socioeconomic mobility, hinges on the former, that is, letting go of his Jewishness, or at least any outer manifestation of it. Mr. Corcoran makes no secret of the fact that he doesn't like Lenny. He sees his New York ways, and they rub him the wrong way. But New York is a kind of way of encoding Jewish in this film, and also encoding a certain class difference. And he doesn't like the fact that Lenny aspires to rise above his place. He tells Lenny, quote, "I don't like one goddamn thing about you," and he tries to pay him off to leave his daughter alone. Neil Simon's screenplay makes clear the gendered stereotypes that attach to the Jewish male of the 20th century in America: mercenary, social climbing, predatory, insincere, fast-talking, and also, oddly, nebbishy. Friedman intends the story, at least on some level, as a satirical criticism. There's a recording of Bruce J. Friedman reading the story out loud in front of an audience, and people are just laughing. I mean, just punctuated with laughter. Audience response to the film is much more complicated and much more varied. The way that viewers interpret Lenny Cantrow and what he does and what happens to him, because as you see, the story arc leads him to finally marry this girl of his dreams. So the way that viewers interpret it is kind of a Rorschach about how they feel about their own masculinity and their own Jewishness. Some viewers see Lenny as a cad, plain and simple. They say he's a man who likes the chase. He doesn't like getting what he wants. He's a guy who's always in an acquisition mode, but who always ends up empty. Other people see him as a romantic ideal, a kind of rebel, a man who refuses to accept the life that was laid out in front of him, the life he was destined for, and who breaks free of constraints to pursue his own happy destiny. In Elaine May's deft hands as director, the film also foregrounds the stereotypes of Jewish women that circulate in Jewish culture at that time. That is, the misogyny that develops within the Jewish community. While older European tropes about Jews tend to focus on Jewish men, and these tropes survived the journey across the Atlantic, it's in 20th century America that a set of new stereotypes develop about Jewish femaleness. These stereotypes emerged within the community as an expression, I believe, of male anxieties about belonging, assimilating, acculturating, fitting in, or being excluded. So let's look at the next slide. In turn of century America, young Jewish women came to stand for a range of visible or imagined habits that marked immigrants as Jewish and impeded their social and cultural and economic mobility. For example, Jewish immigrant women got jobs in factories and shops. They earned money for themselves. They had disposable income, and they often spent at least some portion of that income on themselves. They bought clothing that they liked. They put on makeup. They wanted to feel good and they wanted to look good. And they were criticized roundly by other people in their community and by the Jewish presses for what was seen as their selfish materialism. Even as the immigrant experience on the Lower East Side tenements receded in the past, this image of what came to be called the ghetto girl remained a very strong symbol of Jewish anxieties of exclusion in America. They worried about how the more sedate non-Jewish community would view them, and they would point to the ghetto girl, the so-called ghetto girls, and say, oh, they're going to say all Jews are loud. They're going to say all Jews are materialistic. These female stereotypes originated within the Jewish community, but they circulated beyond it. So if we can see in the next slide, some of you may have seen, and may remember the 1947 film Gentleman's Agreement, based on the Laura Z. Hobson novel of that name. In this movie, there is a probing of a kind of genteel anti-Semitism in post-war America. The film was directed by Elia Kazan, and it revolves around a journalist named Schuyler Philip Green, who decides that he's going to research and write an expose of anti-Semitism among his peers. Although his name is Green, he's not Jewish, and he occupies kind of, let's call it waspy society in New York, high society in New York. And he has come to realize that there is a kind of element of anti-Semitism that floats, and he's going to do an expose about it. So he conducts a kind of social experiment. He says to himself, if nothing about him changed, but people began to think he was Jewish, would they treat him any differently? And the film, in order to sort of let his experiment run, the film minimizes the differences between Jewish and non-Jewish men. So let's look at the next slide. For instance, Green muses on his resemblance to his friend Dave Goldman. Dave Goldman is a Jewish American friend who has just returned from Army service. So whenever we see Dave, he's wearing an American uniform. Phil Green says, dark hair, dark eyes, sure, looking at himself in the mirror. Dark hair has dark eyes, sure, so does Dave. So do a lot of guys who aren't Jewish. No accent, no mannerism, neither does Dave. So there's really no difference. It's just what people think about you. Next slide, please. But in the screenplay, Jewish women, in contrast to Jewish men, have distinct characteristics that mark them as Jewish. Green's secretary, who you see here, is Elaine Wales. She confesses to Green that she's Jewish. He had no idea. She explains to him that when she was looking for a job, she sent out dozens upon dozens of application letters to all the firms that she could think of in New York, and nobody would give her an interview. Then she started sending out letters, not under her own name, which was really Estelle Wolofsky, but under this pseudonym, Elaine Wales, which is not identifiably Jewish. The first letter she sent out was to this newspaper, the one that Green works for, and they hired her. Green was appalled when he realizes that his own company rejected her letter signed by a Jewish name, but accepted her and hired her when they thought she wasn't Jewish. So he talks to the publisher, and the publisher gives him the green light to place an ad to hire a new secretary. And the ad explicitly says, people of all religious backgrounds are invited to apply. He tells this to his secretary, to Elaine/Estelle. Much to his surprise, she's appalled by it. She says to him, an ad that you word that way would attract, quote unquote, the wrong type of Jew, not refined and elegantly dressed Jewish women like her, but ones who wear loud clothing and wear too much rouge. Those are her phrases. And she's clearly afraid that the presence of a Jew like that, a woman who wears loud clothing and too much makeup, would reflect badly on her, that people would judge her in negative ways because they would associate her with the quote-unquote other kind of Jewish women. She says to Green, quote, it's no fun being the fall guy for the kikey ones. This fluid identification of Green with Dave Goldman and Dave Goldman's military uniform and his record of service break with older tropes of the Jewish man as unmanly, weak, and indelibly marked. The concerns that Green's secretary voices about the wrong kind of Jew and how that might reflect on Jewish women like her indicates the enduring resonance of the more recent stereotype of the ghetto girl, of the negativity of the Jewish woman, characteristics that were once associated with Jewish men. Brashness, right? Loudness, pushy, being where they are not wanted. But in this Kazan Moss Hart production, all of this is projected onto the Jewish women. The older tropes of the Jewish male, greedy, effeminate, immoral, vulgar, they never disappear from American culture. Together with newer stereotypes of Jewish women, they gain currency in the New World, and they become part of an internal dynamic through which Jews negotiate their place in America. They think about whether they belong and whether they can be accepted, and they worry about how others see them. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the extensive body of scholarship that unpacks the coalescence of anti-Semitism and misogyny in North American stereotypes that developed in the second half of the 20th century. Things like Japs and Jewish mothers, they develop as kind of internal signifiers for Jews, and they then circulate into broader American culture, into American cultures. In these stereotypes, Jewish men project onto Jewish women characteristics that they don't want other people to see on them. So it's the Jewish woman that's the repository for those things. Pushiness, greed, manipulation, the simultaneous fears of being seen as too Jewish, and also the fear of losing one's Jewishness in America as they respond to the promise but also the threat of assimilation is something they project onto women. And we can see that in the portrayal of Jewish women in this era, in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, in Philip Roth's Goodbye Columbus, in Philip Roth's Portnoy's Complaint, and in Woody Allen, if I can mention his name, Woody Allen's early movies like Radio Days and Annie Hall. As many literary scholars point out, mid-20th century fiction is full of, by Jewish men, is full of these negative images of Jewish women and these glowing, impossibly amazing images of what has come to be called, quote, the ultimate shiksa, or Gentile woman. The metaphor of the non-Jewish woman who is so desirable becomes a metaphor for the world that the Jewish man wants to enter into, wants to attain, and the kind of, let's call it sexualized phrasing, entry to America, entry into a woman, really kind of merge onto one another. Jewish mothers and girlfriends are somehow seen as somehow preventing the Jewish man from achieving excuse me, everything that he can achieve. And they're seen as his roadblocks. The Jap's obsession with her own beauty, with the things she wants, are seen as things that will tax the Jewish man. How could he ever provide for her? How could he ever give her enough? How could he ever have anything for himself? Radiating out from the Jewish community and into more North America, into North American humor more broadly, these stereotypes, they grow, they circulate, they become recognizably part of not only Jewish culture but American culture, and they layer misogyny on anti-Semitism. In 21st century America, both the older tropes of the Jewish male and the newer tropes born in America, particularly of the Jewish woman, have enduring value. And the unmanliness of the Jewish male is seen as something enduring, and the negativity of the Jewish female is seen as something enduring. And in the time that remains, I want to look at a case study. I wrote briefly about this, excuse me, before. And if we can see the next slide. I'd like to unpack for you a book that possibly you've never read. It's a book written by Christina Grish in 2005, and it's called Boy Vey, The Shiksa's Guide to Dating Jewish Men. It's a guide to dating and marrying Jewish men, and it illustrates the endurance of gendered anti-Semitic tropes into the 21st century, even under radically shifting understandings of gender, ethnicity, and race. And I would say even in a book that one could call philo-Semitic. The ideas like, as a non-Jewish woman, the author likes dating Jewish men, thinks it would be great to marry a Jewish man, thinks that other non-Jewish women like herself would want that, and even in that context, some of these anti-Semitic tropes flit through. So Boy Vey offers these helpful tips to non-Jewish women who want to date and marry Jewish men, and the underlying assumption is that Jewish men make better husbands than non-Jewish men do, because they are different in essence from non-Jewish men. And when you hear difference in essence, that already should trigger something suspicious in you. She's dated a bunch of Jewish men, and she draws upon her experiences to write these guides and to talk about the characteristics she saw as attaching to Jewish men and not to non-Jewish men. So Jewish men as a category, and these continue some of the tropes that we've seen. So for example, unlike Jewish men are sensitive and communicative. They're well-educated, they're articulate, they're affectionate, and they're family-minded. They're closely tied, she says, to a powerful mother, and she says that's a good thing because the Jewish male, she says, emulates his mother's nurturing qualities. He emulates her connection with food. He'll cook for you, maybe. And he emulates her concern with personal grooming and hygiene. As Grish enthuses the Jewish male, and now I'll read an extensive passage, the Jewish male talks about your relationship more than you do. He's wildly intense inside the bedroom and out. Thinks nudging him up the corporate ladder is a sign of affection. Jewish men feed your mind and your appetite, and they're the ultimate caregivers without a hint of machismo. They're also generous and thoughtful, thanks to a matriarchal culture that taught them to appreciate women's strength, candor, humor, and intelligence. And Jewish men value professional drive. Because Jewish men, according to Grish, admire and even love strong women, you don't have to act weak or mask your intelligence when you're with them. All those are good things. They're raised by mothers who place them at the center of the universe, and because of that, they have confidence, and they're not constantly asking you for reassurance. They have self-esteem, and that helps foster intimate relations and family relationships. As Grish sees it, Jewish masculinity is inherently different from and better than other kinds of masculinity. Jewish men are less aggressive, they're more accommodating, they're more verbal, they're more respectful of women, they are cleaner than non-Jewish men, and in fact, Jewish men are more like women. That's the only way to put it. In her assessment, the sexuality of the Jewish man deviates from normative masculinity in ways that resonate, I would say, uncomfortable with earlier anti-Semitic tropes. Non-Jewish women, she says, will not know, quote, what to expect from his sex drive. The aberrant masculine sexuality of the racialized other is a recurrent figure in European and American culture, and we see it here. The male other is depicted as having a more or a less powerful libido than a normal man, as exercising more or less restraint than a normative male, as pursuing perverse or violent sexual practices and harboring aberrant desires. In the long discourse on Jews in Europe, the abnormal sexuality of the Jewish male was tied to the matter of circumcision. The different male genitals were seen to embody Jewish difference. As her book expresses, though, this admiration for what she considers to be the distinctly Jewish attributes of Jewish men, Boivay also reproduces positive, negative stereotypes of Jews. They are, she says, overly attached to their mothers and thus arrested at the Oedipal stage. Jewish men, she says, have profound neuroses that complicate relationships with non-Jewish women. They are obsessed with professional success and with accumulating wealth. Women who date Jewish men have to contend with their deeply entrenched miserliness. Jewish men, the guide explains to its readers, go to extreme measures to save money. They ride subways, she says, quote, for the cheap air conditioning on a muggy day. They purchase generic prescription medication to save money, and they frequent sales at, quote unquote, 50% off, then ask for an additional 10% because the sea lion's flipper is chipped. These negative attributes, of course, are merely the flip side of the characteristics that Grish praises, enumerated now in the same book with a different valence. The ambivalence of Jewish male characteristics suggests an instability in Jewish gender identity, where the superior nature of Jewish male sexuality can easily degenerate into this perverse opposite. These images are consistent with long-standing tropes of the Jew as implicated in mental illness, deviance, venality, and avarice. Further, Grish warns of the abnormality of the Jewish male body. She says they have, quote, more body hair than a yak. Jewish male sexuality, she says, is thus unmediated by civilized human norms and societal restraints. It's more instinctual, it's more animalistic. It's a different way of talking about the lack of sexual inhibitions that Grish repeatedly says she admires. Now, if Grish's description of the attributes of Jewish men has an undercurrent of anti-Semitism, her description of Jewish women amplifies the negative tropes that circulate in American culture about Jewish women. Grish asserts that Jewish men hardly ever desire Jewish women. Quote, if a man's in bed with another Jew who makes the same sounds his mom or cousin makes, it is not that sexy. In an interview with the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, Grish suggested that Jewish men reject their female counterparts because Jewish women are self-absorbed and concerned with material wealth. The single Jewish female is, quote, too strong and demanding, placing too much pressure on the male, particularly regarding professional and financial achievement and bodily perfection. Of course, these repellent attributes that attach to the Jewish female are precisely the characteristics that Boivay finds appealing in the Jewish male: professional drive, appreciation of women's strength and candor, and the help of women who nudge him up the corporate ladder. Projected, though, onto the Jewish female, Grish casts these traits in negative lights. But in Grish's construction of Jewish gender identity, there's clearly a more fundamental reason for the Jewish male rejection of the Jewish female. They are so alike as to be identical. The Jewish male character is inflected with the feminine and the Jewish female with the masculine, so that ultimately they become indistinguishable. In that sense, Jewish endogamy is presented as a deviant form of sexuality, both incestuous and queer. This connects Grish's sensibility with an earlier and long-standing discourse on the objectionable separateness of Jewish exclusionary practices. A little bit more on Grish, and then I'll come to a close. Grish celebrates the distance that contemporary Jewish men have placed between themselves and the Jewish past. Boivay imagines that Jewish ancestors, quote, schwitz in their graves as their reform or simply acculturated male descendants select non-Jewish mates. In her formulation, openness to intermarriage is both a sign of Jewish acculturation in America and proof that the Jew has repudiated the objectionable insularity of his ancestry. However, although the Jewish men on Grish's radar are disconnected from traditional religious practice and belief, telling Jewish traits endure. So while she affirms the possibility of acculturating Jews in a liberal society, Boivay also posits that Jewishness is something indelible. It doesn't disappear no matter what kind of choices Jewish people make. So even in the context of an interfaith couple, and in the absence of adherence to Jewish religious practices or ethnic practices, the Jewish male remains always identifiable as such. In that sense, the desired relationship between the Jewish male and the non-Jewish woman is both the fulfillment but also the failure of Jewish belonging. He's desirable because he's a Jewish male. Some critics argue that in the new millennium, a lot of these stereotypes evaporated, that we think about race and culture and religion and ethnicity in new and very different ways. I wonder if that's true, and I wonder if you think that that's true. Notwithstanding, I think, the greater diversity in representations of Jews in popular culture, I think that the endurance of Jewish stereotypes in contemporary culture, we see it, the Jewish mother, the princess, the neurotic, effeminate man, and the greedy climber, they still exist. They still have currency. And some of that came up as you were describing the guide and the kind of stereotypes that people hear. And we're only beginning to assess the influence of internet production and what kind of circulates there. And we don't know how such images will morph under current social conditions. But one thing is clear, at moments of cultural anxiety, whether anxiety within the Jewish community about belonging or the anxieties raised in a dominant culture because things are poised on the edge of change or things are changing too rapidly, at moments of cultural anxiety, anti-Semitism gains new steam, gains new currency, and always emerges in gendered forms. Thank you. I'd love to hear your comments and questions, and some of you probably know more about contemporary culture than I do, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
And I just wanted to say, for people with comments, you have to use this microphone, and it's for the live stream. So if you want to be heard, then you need to use the mic. And I'm going to take the opportunity as the person up here to ask the first question. I have a lot of questions, and I really, really enjoyed the talk. And I do teach Gentleman's Agreement, and part of Kirsten's book on name changing and things like that. So it was very interesting to see some other examples as well. But my question is about this boy Vey, which of course I've never seen. And I guess my first question is, and you seem to posit it that she's actually serious, which seems kind of impossible to believe. So the first question, is she actually serious? And secondly, I imagine there's a lot of, and I'm going to use the word schlock out there, that is kind of, perpetuating these stereotypes, playing on them, this and that. So I wonder, why this book and what's the currency of this book? And just curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And is she serious? Yes, but she writes in a funny vein. And the kind of a flurry of interviews that she had right after the book was published, I think made the point that she was serious, that people are marrying outside of people of their own backgrounds, that intermarriage is on the rise in America, that many people see that as a good thing, mix up the gene pool a little, doors are open in America. It seems to exemplify the American value of openness, of lack of barriers, that if you're not Jewish and you're willing to marry somebody Jewish, that's sort of proof in a way that you're not prejudiced. But she says, it's not so easy to marry somebody whose background is different than yours. And so let me write this book. I think it'll be popular because I'm not the only one dating non-Jewish guys. And it is funny. So is it serious? Yes. Is it not serious? Also yes, right? In the same way, I think that a movie like Heartbreak Kid is serious, but also it's funny. I think that you can't really write a guide to marrying Jewish men for non-Jewish women and not write it as something that's funny. So she writes it with a sense of humor, but I do think she's serious in her intent, and I do think there was an audience for it. And I think that the inner contradictions that emerge in it are really, really telling, because she could write the book without a self-awareness of those inner contradictions, and her editor could read it and let it go through without an awareness of those inner contradictions. And the sense in which these Jewish men, they're free enough, they're liberated enough from their background to want to marry a woman who's not only be willing, but want to marry. They love their mothers on the one hand, but on the other hand, they don't want women who are too much like their mothers. It's just such a kind of entanglement of things that, in some way I think she's a good observer, because I think those inner contradictions are things that are experienced within the Jewish community, that there are so many aspects to wanting to be part of a dominant culture, wanting to acculturate, wanting to assimilate, and how a person defines what acculturation is and how that differs from assimilation very much has to do with where they stand, what they want to do, what they think is, good for their own life and not good for their own life. And that sort of being poised between, I want to enter into the dominant culture, I don't want my Jewishness to hold me back, but, maybe I don't want to lose my Jewishness. That already is sort of suggested even in Heartbreak Kid, in that last, the slide I showed you that shows the wedding shot from the back where Lenny is kneeling with Kelly, and there's a big cross over them. So then we kind of see the wedding, just a couple of moments in the wedding, and she's going, come, honey, and he goes, just a minute, a couple of people I want to talk to. So rather than following this bride who he was so intent on winning over for the entirety of the movie, he hangs around and he talks to people at the wedding about business and things like that. And in the last scene, he's sitting with two, 10 or 12-year-olds and talking about business and sporting goods stores and how to make investments, and the kids can't wait to get away from him. And there's this look in his eyes, and again, one of the wonderful things about the film is that there are very long takes on people's faces and silence. And you look at Lenny's face and you think, what is he feeling? And again, as I said, it's kind of like a Rorschach. But in this last scene, is he thinking, what's my next move? I got it. Do I really want it? Or what am I doing in this church? What did I leave behind? Or who knows? We don't know. But there's a discomfort here. It's not the glowing guy rushing out with his bride. It's not like The Graduate, Dustin Hoffman kind of ending. I triumphed. I got her. It's something a little bit uncomfortable that invites us again to think about those ambivalences. I want so badly to be accepted. I want to be like everybody else. I want to be Lenny who gets Kelly, or I want to be Estelle Wolofsky who gets to be Elaine and nobody knows she's Jewish. But then again, who am I? Is there an empty place inside of me? And that it's those ambivalences that are so charged that I think lead to the generating of the stereotypes within the Jewish community. I'm sorry. Yeah.
You called me out. Hi. So I really enjoyed tons of it, all of it. Although it's interesting. I have a question and then I have some thoughts. I mean, the use of The Graduate that you just offered was really interesting because I actually see both of those as being super ambivalent. Like the end of The Graduate, right? They run and they're victorious and then they both look at each other like, what the hell did we do? Like, is this what we want? And my memory of the end of Heartbreak Kid is that he sings the song that Jeannie Berlin was singing the whole way that was really annoying, right? And he sings it in this kind of like very longing-ish kind of way, that I think pulls out more of the, so it seemed to me like actually before you said The Graduate, I was thinking, oh, this is just they were trying for a Jewish version of The Graduate, basically, like, or they, there was sort of there were elements to kind of both of this as kind of like this generational moment.
Yes, because Michael Nichols directed The Graduate and he and Elaine May were married, so there's that element as well.
Exactly, yeah. So I'm sorry, this is all inside baseball. I'm just like commenting on what you're saying. I really, really loved the sort of inside or outside, the internal discourse and external discourse that you started with. But I wanted to ask you to kind of follow it through a little bit in some of the examples that you have. So, do you read certain of these, to what extent is there an interpenetration of those discourses, of external and internal discourse? And I'm wondering, especially because Gentleman's Agreement is very mixed, right, in the people who create it, right? Elia Kazan's not Jewish, Laura Z. Hobson is. And incidentally, you didn't talk about it, but Laura Z. Hobson has really different gender politics in the book than in the movie, right?
Right. And Moss Hart, who wrote the script, is Jewish.
Yeah. I mean, there's, that's one of the things that I think is so interesting about it, is that kind of interpenetration. And I'm wondering, how you see that playing out in some of these other, like, do you see Grisham's as being solely a non-Jew, right? And being sort of completely shaped only by a non-Jew's discourse, only by an external discourse, or do you think it's been shaped, right? Who's her publisher, right? Who are the audiences? Who are the guys she married, right? And I guess I would ask the same thing even about, well, you used Hester Street, which I think has more Jewish, but still, but the Heartbreak Kid too has Sybil Shepherd in it, at least as an actress, right? Who's not Jewish.
Right.
So I guess that's one question that I have for you, is to maybe think more about like how, in what ways are these interpenetrating, in what ways are they shaped by one another?
Right.
And then I just have a final question, which is not really related to this, but I've been working on anti-Semitism in a very different space that's thinking about a lot of the stuff we talked about in the guide, protocols, and a lot of political discourse that doesn't seem to have gender in it, and yet I want to find gender in it. So I guess that's just like my additional call to you. Like, do you see, in addition to sort of these kinds of domestic places where men and women are very clearly figured, do you see gender playing out in other kinds of anti-Semitic, more political places, I guess, where the Jew is the Jew, and sometimes male, but sometimes it's just the Jew? So sorry to ask a lot of questions.
No, those are really great questions, and those are really great thoughts. And I did break it up into an external and an internal discourse, but they feed and they fuel each other and they intertwine with each other. Certainly, Jews Jews exist in a dominant culture, and I think Jews can't help but also see themselves through the eyes of the dominant culture. I think about W.E. Du Bois writing about blackness in America as having a kind of similar dynamic, right? Like this idea of two-ness, right? The double vision. You see yourself through your own terms, but you also cannot help but see yourself through the eyes of the dominant culture. And that shapes how one sees oneself, and within the Jewish community, that also shapes how one sees other Jews. And if one wants to imagine oneself as more like the dominant culture, then one has to figure out who it is that is the real Jew that you're not, right? So that is part of how the external imagining of Jews, the external imaging of Jews, how it becomes internalized and kind of morphs within the Jewish community. But, as Jews develop these stereotypes that are born within the Jewish community, like the ghetto girl or the Jewish princess or the Jewish mother, they so quickly float out into popular culture. They float out partly because Jews have been really successful using those images to create fine literature, to create movies, to create stand-up comedy. And people like it. People relate to it. People relate to the Jewish mother, and I think sometimes they relate to its Jewishness, but I think sometimes they relate to its motherness. Jewish mothers aren't the only Jewish mothers. So I think there is this constant intermeshing of how the dominant culture sees Jewish people and how Jewish people see themselves and talk about themselves, sometimes with a kind of disarming self-denigration that can be read as funny and deflecting, but also can be read as serious. And depending on who picks it up and how they pick it up, that's where it comes up. And I think, I think about the guide that you have written. It's so hard to, some comments are so blatantly anti-Semitic, but some things have to do with who says what, in what context, and with what expression. And those are such, less tangible things to impart. And I think that's where some of these images, tropes begin to circulate out in Jewish culture and resonate in different ways and in different places. But, I'm sort of thinking about the issue you raised of how to bring gender into this guide. I think about my campus, for example. I teach at York University in Toronto, and the demographics of our student body, because Canadians, as some of you may know, Canadians don't tend to have the American experience of going to college and dorming. Canadians tend to go to a university that they can commute to from home, from their family of origin. Because of that, the demographics of our student body pretty much mimics the demographics of the Toronto and suburban areas as a whole. And that means that people are living at home, living in their communities of origins, and they bring that with them, I think in many ways much more than when students come to college dorm and almost form not a homogenized, but a homogenizing student community. So on my campus, Muslim women are visibly marked because they wear hijabs. Muslim men are not necessarily visibly marked. You might think, oh, he kind of looks Middle Eastern, maybe, or maybe he's Latina, I'm not sure, right? These sort of vagueness, these sort of racialized vaguenesses that people sometimes have. So it's Muslim women who are visually marked because they wear hijabs, and it's Jewish religious men, Muslim religious women religious enough to wear hijab, and Jewish men religious enough to wear kippah on campus who are visibly marked. And both of those attract certain kinds of looks and certain kinds of comments from different people. Sometimes nice comments, but very often, if they're from strangers, they're unwanted comments and comments that make them feel unsafe and kind of on edge, unsafe and unwanted. And so whether a person looks Jewish, whatever that means, or looks Muslim, whatever that means, certainly choosing to wear the garments that you feel your faith demands that you make puts you out there and makes you a kind of target or repository for people's comments and people's projections. So on our campus, the guys who wear kippot range from kind of modern Orthodox, they love Israel, to Haredi, they don't really love Israel. Whether or not they love Israel or not, if they wear a kippah, they have all gotten comments about, nasty things that Israelis do to Palestinians, right? So it doesn't matter who they are, what they think, they are visibly Jewish. Some Jewish students wear Magen David, some of them have decided not to wear them, and the young women who wear them, they kind of put themselves out there as marked. We have some religious Jewish women who wear kind of long jean skirts, but you have to know that long jean skirts defines a religious girl. If you're outside of that community, you just think, oh, here's somebody in my class who has a long jean skirt. She's stylish, or maybe she's not stylish, maybe that's last year's style, but you don't necessarily interpret that as belonging to a certain group that you're then going to interpret for them. So it's kind of interesting that in terms of people interpreting who you are, on our campus at least, it's Muslim women and Jewish men who kind of attract that. I don't know if that begins to kind of answer ways to think about it. We also have Sikhs on our campus who wear turbans, but again, so that's a kind of male marking.
Hi, thank you so much. This is really interesting. During your whole presentation, I was kind of thinking about a very contemporary example, which is John Mulaney and his ex-wife. Are you familiar with that? So for anyone who doesn't know, so there's a comedian, John Mulaney, and his ex-wife was Jewish, and a lot of his comedy centered around her Jewishness, and he would even never introduce her by name, but as my Jewish wife. And he would talk a lot about how he loves that she's assertive, and that, he never has to wonder what she's thinking because she'll tell him, and things like that. And it felt kind of endearing when they were together, because the whole point of it was how much he loves his Jewish wife. But then they recently got divorced, and looking back on it now, it comes across as really insensitive and anti-Semitic. And so a lot of people in my friend group, because we all enjoy John Mulaney's comedy, but we've kind of been trying to reconcile how to deal with those comments. Are they anti-Semitic, and does this change how we perceive the comedy? I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, or how that connects to the larger story about gender and anti-Semitism.
That's such an interesting, it's such an interesting observation, such an interesting set of questions, because what I'm wondering is whether you go back and listen to his earlier sort of monologues about his wife, and hear it differently, or whether you just think that the newer stuff is kind of has this resonance of anti-Semitism.
So we haven't talked about her since the divorce, so it's really the earlier stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I don't know. I haven't actually thought about that, but I will think about it. But it's kind of like, more broadly, the kinds of things that one half of a couple say about the other, with affection about their quirks, resonates differently when that relationship goes bad. The very same comments carry a certain kind of weight. So I'm going to give that thought. I think that's a really interesting. It's a really interesting question. It's part of. It attaches to the question of what kind of comments can you get away with saying, and who do you have to be to get away with it, right? So, rap music can use words for African American people that we don't use, or I don't use in my classroom, I don't use in my discourse, but it's acceptable in the discourse of rap music, and it's acceptable in certain conversational groups. Jewish people maybe can make comments about other Jewish people and play with those stereotypes that maybe would sound different among people who aren't Jewish. But then you get to really close friends, one's Jewish and one's not, couple, one's Jewish and one's not. They come off as affectionate, but then do they have an edge to them? And that comes back to whether Jews, it's like Zygmunt Bauman's idea of allo-Semitism. The precursor to anti-Semitism is a belief that Jews are simply different than other people. Philo-Semitism says, yes, they're different, but they're better. Anti-Semitism says, yes, they're different, but they're worse. And although I have a lot of colleagues who say, I'll take philo-Semitism, bring it on, they really are the flip side of the same thing, because they assert that Jewishness is an indelible trait that makes people inherently different. And out of that, things radiate that are discomforting.
Thank you. That was really fascinating to hear. And it just reminded me of kind of many of the aspects that maybe we didn't include in the guide, because otherwise it would be even longer, that were part of our discussions. But some of them involve kind of negative stereotypes that maybe aren't part of centuries-long, particular troops, and are more context-driven in the U.S. or other countries. So that's really interesting. I think some of the aspects you talked about were kind of the loud and pushy kind of stereotypes, and it's kind of interesting to kind of think about that and how it may or may not be gendered on college campuses, for instance. So we had an example when looking at how to be sensitive in the classroom in a way of a loud Jewish student that someone had brought up. And then many Jewish faculty, of course, aren't coming from the Midwest, they're coming from other places, and perhaps their implicit biases of perceiving them as loud and pushy. And so I'm wondering if that can be kind of an intersection with gender, where women, if they're more assertive and pushy, are seen in a different way as men, where it's seen as a positive trait. And there could be kind of this intersection of gender with that, but also Jews with that, even among both students and faculty. So I wanted to get kind of your reaction to that. There's so many things we didn't get to in the guide. And then along with that, something that I think is really interesting is Deborah Tannen's work on intercultural conversation, because she'll be like, yes, there's certain cultures who are stereotyped as maybe loud and pushy or as interrupting, when they're really, I forget her term for it, where you're kind of just jumping in because you're paying attention and you're continuing the conversation. It's not really interruption. So these are all the kind of things that we didn't even get to, and otherwise it would be too long, but I'd kind of be interested in your reactions to those.
I think those are really important things, and I can understand why they're not in your guide, because they're complicated and they are dynamic. I mean, these are dynamic issues, right? These are dynamic conversations about how things layer onto one another, and about how people read behaviors that are deemed appropriate or inappropriate in a certain, let's call it, type or category of people. And the layering of, I think, the female onto the Jew, it certainly does heighten that sense of somebody is too pushy, too aggressive, too materialistic, too dominant, because women are that already, and Jews are like that already, and you put them together and like, wow, that really, blows you away. I can't imagine that you can get everything into this guide. And so clearly it's a prompt for like having conversation. I mean, I would imagine, I would hope, that once you have a document like this circulating on campus, particularly if there's a trigger moment in a classroom that makes somebody kind of turn to it, you'll have conversations happening on your campus that will ask, you know, questions like this that have really great, I don't want to say answers, but really great conversations emerge from that. Really interesting kind of refinements and reflections and kind of awarenesses of others and self-awareness. But I think that's, you know, that's really spot on, that sense of layering and reading certain behaviors. Okay.
So yeah, in popular culture, probably the most famous stereotype of the overbearing Jewish mother would be the character of Howard Wolowitz on The Big Bang Theory. The actress who played her actually died, so they had to write the character off. But that's probably the sort of very overbearing, except for her character was silent, but was depicted as the overbearing for her voice and the way she was described. And then once again, the character Howard was depicted as had a perverted, but had a obsession with perhaps as a version which it goes, and then of course some friends of mine have criticized the show as being very predictable, the humor and stuff, regardless of whether or not people found it offensive or not.
That's a really good comment. I think shows like that, you know, it's so much, in some measure, things like that are maybe in the eyes of the viewer. There are television programs that, for example, my husband loves and thinks are hysterical, and I watch them. I'm going, do you know what you're watching? Do you know what they're saying? Like, so I think that's a really good comment. The Jewish mother is such an interesting figure because she is the flip side of saying that women are the ones who are entrusted with preserving culture, with making sure that families who have meager resources all have enough to eat, for making sure that in places where it's dangerous to go about, you are safe. So it's taking this sort of positive source of keeping families together, transmitting culture, keeping people fed and safe, and turning it into something quite negative in a land of abundance, in a land where keeping me safe transmutes into keeping me locked into you and not where I want to go. And turns into something that's sort of overbearing and suffocating rather than something that brings salvation. So I think it's kind of interesting. To my mind, the most successful artistic representations of the Jewish mother would be able to somehow flesh out both sides of that, you know?
All right. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk and wonderful questions. And to everybody watching at home, thank you for watching. And I guess that's it. Anything else? Yes, do you want to announce?
I think our next event is on September 28th. And it's Professor Sa'ar talking about her co-authored work on Palestinian women in Israel and how they've had all kinds of areas that they have, grown in different areas, but that also kind of, she's trying to complicate that and challenge those things as well. So that's on September 28th. And if you'd like to be part of our email listserv to learn about our events or our newsletters, you can contact us or contact me individually at aronoffy@msu.edu. Thank you so much. Yep.
So this is the book, the Mason Book Club.
Oh, yeah, that's a really